Thanks for completing yesterday's goal, 400 subscribes in new channel. Creepypasta rules. Today can we reach 600 subscribes? I know you can do it. r/nosleep. Posted by u/Polterkites. The man in my basement takes one step closer every week. Part 5. Leg in a blue cast, I hobbled across the street on crutches. 49 hours had passed since I fell down the stairs and saw the intruder in the basement. Or at least, I saw his hands. Regardless, enough was enough. I needed concrete answers and a concrete plan. At this rate, the intruder would reach my room in weeks, maybe days. I pounded on the neighbor's door and stopped. Something inside moved. Through frosted windows, down the hallway, the blurry shadow of a door creaked open. Someone peeked out. I waved politely, but they stepped back into the room and pulled the door shut. I raised my hand to knock when the front door swung open. There stood P.T. Carver, dressed in blue jeans and a brown shirt. Looking even more Clint Eastwood-like than before. "Brandon," he said, smiling warmly. I opened my mouth to respond, but realized I didn't even know his name, just the initials. "Paul's fine," he said, stepping back from the door and motioning me inside. "Paul," I propped forward onto my crutches and... Wait. He reached behind the door and produced a box of disposable light blue masks. "You don't mind?" he said, putting a mask on himself and handing another to me. "Of course not," I said and put the mask on. "Getting too old to risk it, you know," said Paul, stepping back from the door, and once again motioning me inside. As I stepped inside, his eyes dropped to the blue cast around my leg. He raised an eyebrow. "Fell down the stairs," I said. "Ouch." He shut the door and I glanced around the house. The interior contradicted my expectations. Varnished oak walls with a smooth shine. His house felt like an old Wall Street corner office, like in those movies where men in suits pull whiskey out from beneath their desks. There was no upstairs, only the first floor, a couple bedrooms, and a door that led to what I assumed was a basement. A long hallway led to the back of the house, and I noticed the room which someone had peered out from. The door was still shut. The air smelled like tobacco and vanilla. Not a bad smell, at least not me. Tobacco scent always reminded me of my dad's house back in Georgia, back when I was a kid and still somewhat happy. I kicked off my shoes and pressed my sock-covered feet against the floor. In this oddly fancy house, the carpet was out of place, green, scratchy, worn down to the plywood in some areas. "Please," said Paul, motioning towards the living room. I shuffled deeper into the house. Despite the sunny day outside, it was dark in here. All the blinds pulled shut, everything cast in shadow save for a couple desk lights and beams of intruding sunlight. "Feel free to take a seat," said Paul, nodding towards a long, green velvet couch. I slumped down and immediate relief came over. Hobbling around on crutches was more tiring than it looked. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" said Paul. "I'm good. Thanks." Paul winced, as though I offended him. "You sure? Water?" "No, thanks." Paul sat down on a wooden stool across from me. A stool that creaked with antique strain. Crossing his legs, he leaned sideways against the wall, studying me like a therapist studies a client. "So?" I took a deep breath and exhaled. "Last night, I saw him." Paul's face remained neutral. He shifted his weight slightly. "Saw who?" "The intruder." I leaned forward in my seat. "What I saw has no reasonable hands, barely human." I trailed off into silence. "You take a photo?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way." "Why?" He studied me carefully before continuing. "You seen a doctor?" "No." He glanced down at the cast on my leg, then back up to me. I rolled my eyes. "Well, yes." "You tell him about?" "No." His face filled with strange relief. Uncrossing his legs, he leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "Do not tell anyone else about this, not even Mitch, you understand?" "Sure." Paul leaned back, reached into the chest pocket of his shirt, and pulled out a cigarette. He pulled off his mask, and tossed it back over his shoulder. He brought the cigarette up to his mouth, pinched it between his thin lips and took out a pack of matches. A thump reverberated from somewhere deep inside the house. He froze, raised an eyebrow. Silence. He shrugged, struck the match and another thumb. Paul shook out the match and tossed it into an Alpha-Getty's tin can sat upon a yellow plastic crate to his left. "Excuse me," he said, stepping up, turning around, and marching deeper into the house. I watched as he rounded the corner and disappeared into the foyer hallway. Now I was starting to wonder if coming over here was such a good idea to begin with. My initial meeting with Paul was surprising to say the least. His long, drawn-out bear safety monologue was odd, but endearing, in a weird sort of way. But when Paul showed up at the diner, Mitch seemed truly disturbed. Like he'd seen a ghost. Either way, I just wanted answers. Hopefully, Paul would give me that. Right then, the sound of door clicked open in the foyer hallway, then it clicked shut. The faintest hint of a smell entered my nostrils, the recurring smell of gasoline and burned hair. So subtle, it might have been imagined. Down the hallways, muffled voices. Arguing? I tilted my head and strained to listen but... "Sorry about that," said Paul, suddenly stepping into the room. "No worries." With oddly pin-straight posture, Paul sat down on the couch across from me. A brown, velvet couch with old-time drawings of farms and ducks that reminded me of a sofa at my grandma's house. The same one I slept on after Grandpa's funeral. "You want answers, huh?" said Paul, striking a match, lighting up the cigarette and finally taking a slow, satisfied drag. The smoke lingered around him for a moment, then slowly drifted back towards the dining room. "Why does Mitch think you're dead?" Paul nodded, as though expecting the question, reaching over the side of the couch. He tapped the cigarette with his pointer finger. Small bits of glowing ash broke off and tumbled down into the tin can. "Back when Mitch and Rachel, his sister, were kids," said Paul, "I had some serious, health issues. Still do, full disclosure, but I'm medicated now and that helps." He lifted the cigarette to take another drag but stopped short, remembering something. He lowered it and continued, "After my father passed away, I started to believe something was stalking me. Toying with me." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, started with small things at first, bumps in the night, food gone bad before the expiry date. Things too small to talk about, but too big to just, brush off. He met my eyes, then looked away and took another short drag off the cigarette. I thought back to the expired milk in my fridge, one of many unanswered questions still festering in the back of my mind. Paul sighed. "I'm a rationalist at heart, so, the possibility of something unnatural," he waved his fingers like a magician, "that never crossed my thoughts." He paused again, glancing over at me, judging my reactions as he spoke. "Now bear with me, cause all this leads to a point," he continued. "One night, back in '94, maybe '93, the kids and their mom were fast asleep. It was Thursdays so, I went down to the basement for canned peaches and a late-night beer." He pointed down at the floor. "The light wasn't working so, I came back with a flashlight hand." He trailed off into silence, his cold blue eyes still locked on the floor. This time someone was down there. Just standing there. Stood down the basement hallway with their back turned to me. I wanted to call out, scream, run upstairs get my 9mm but, instead, I just froze. Like roadkill in headlights, Paul looked directly at me. That's when it hit me. I realized that this intruder, over 7 foot tall by the way, he was halfway stuck into the concrete wall. Like the mold set around him and dried there. Paul shook his head like a chill went down his spine. I couldn't even think straight. He leaned forward and rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. A weird tic that suddenly stood out to me. Mitch did the same thing, and so did Howie. Things got really bad after that. The more I tried to fight it, the worse it got. The more I tried to make sense of things. He trailed off into a moment of silence. Of course, nobody else saw him. They just saw a stack of cardboard boxes. He paused again, looking around the room. One night. Cold, autumn night, I downed 2 bottles of cognac and brought my 9mm downstairs. Marched straight up to him. He made a gun with his fingers and pointed at me, pressed the barrel between his dead eyes and pulled the trigger. He mimed the motion of gun kickback and limply dropped his hand back onto his thigh. But he didn't even flinch. Bullet went straight through him, ricocheted off the back wall and got me in the hand. He held up his left hand, the pinky finger was cut off short at the first knuckle. I hadn't even noticed until now. He shook his hand like it went numb and leaned back into his seat again. After that, Holly threatened to leave, take the kids with her. He rubbed the side of his palm against his left forearm, ruminating. Then his eyes suddenly lit up as if remembering something. "Let me show you something," he said, pushing up from the couch. He strolled towards the door I assumed led to the basement. I remained seated. After my last encounter with the intruder, I wasn't a big fan of stairs, or basements. "You coming?" Paul, noticing my hesitation, looked back at me the same way my dad used to, struggling to hide disappointment. I cleared my throat, grabbed my crutches, and pushed to standing. Paul smiled a half a smile, pulled another disposable mask out from his back pocket, and put it on. Stood in front of the basement door, he pulled a ring of keys out from his front pocket. Humming to himself, he rifled through until finding the key he wanted. He unlatched the chosen key and turned the lock. No dice. He relatched the key and went back to rifling, still humming all the while. Meanwhile, I stood back about 10 feet, eyes locked on the mysterious room at the end of the hallway. The door was shut. "You live alone?" "Yes," said Paul. "Well, yes and no." He unlatched another key and gave that one a try. No dice. "An old friend lives in the room down the hall. I'm the caretaker, sort of," he said nonchalantly. "That's good of you." "Yeah, well, I owe them one," said Paul. I considered asking more, asking if they were a guest keeping the intruder at bay, but something told me to keep it to myself. Paul huffed, unlatching a third key from the ring, holding it up to his face. He studied it like a jeweler studies a suspect diamond. He brought it down to the lock, pushed it in, and turned. Finally, the door clicked open. Third time's the. Paul looked around searching for words, the same way Howie did. Shaking his head, Paul tucked away the key and stepped down into the dark. He flicked the light on and cold fluorescent glow stammered to life. Concrete walls and wooden steps smothered in layers of dust. Paul looked back over his shoulder. "You good with stairs?" he said, looking down at my cast-covered leg. "I'll try." He nodded. "Use the railing." He turned back and stepped deeper into the basement. I hobbled across the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs. Peering down, the flight of steps seemed longer than expected. Like it went down 1.5 stories, instead of just one. Paul stood at the bottom, another door in front of him. Though maybe door wasn't quite the right word, more like a bunker hatch, metallic and held shut with an arm-sized lever instead of a doorknob. I didn't want to go into the basement, but the weight of morbid curiosity compelled me yet again. Paul gripped his hands around the lever, braced himself against the wall, and pulled. His wiry arms flexed and strained as the lever slowly lurched towards him. Gritting his teeth, Paul yanked harder and harder until finally, the lever gave way, swung backward suddenly. The metallic door itself shifted downward with an echoing clang, and clouds of dust particles burst out from the edges. Paul wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, squat down, and grabbed the bottom of the door with both hands. Hoisting upward, he pushed the door into a vertical swing. It pressed flat up against the ceiling. There was nothing but darkness ahead. Paul crept forward, and silence followed. 5 long seconds ticked by until a light flicked on. More cold, stuttering glow. "You good?" Paul's voice echoed up the staircase. Yeah, I'm okay," I said and stepped forward, once again being dragged by the magnetic pull of morbid curiosity. Going downstairs on crutches was even more tedious than expected. The whole precarious journey took about 3 minutes until, finally, I stepped into the basement. A long narrow hallway led to a two-way fork in the path. Dirt floors, plywood walls. "I've got an engineering/construction background," said Paul, strolling forward. "Built this place from the ground up." He stopped at the fork in the hallway and looked both ways, thinking. He looked left, he looked right, he looked left again. He shrugged. "Gotta be this way." He pushed forward and I followed. "Basement's bigger than you'd think," he said as we rounded the corner. Another narrow hallway led about 20 feet ahead until it reached another two-way fork. Paul kept walking, and I kept following. I put up these walls, tried to build a maze around him, slow him down. He chuckled, rounding another corner. Then I put up the bunker hatch and he trailed off into silence, rounding yet another corner. We entered a 10-foot by 10-foot room. He stepped into the middle, and turned back to face me. "This, my friend, is the construction of a former madman," he said playfully, looking around. "Holly left me halfways into me building it." He shook his head and spat at the ground. "I don't blame her." He looked directly at me. "Look, kid," he paused, "you want all this to go away, you want to stop having these encounters? Work on yourself." I blinked. "Are you kidding me?" Half shrugging, he continued, "Look, I know how it sounds. But after Holly took the kids and left, it really kicked me into gear. I stopped drinking, got help, professional help. Started taking meds, the right meds. And sure enough, all this went away. No more man in the basement, no more altered reality bullshit. I know it's the last thing you want to hear, but this thing. It's all in your mind. You don't think it's a little odd that my hallucinations match yours?" Paul nodded understandingly. "What do you think set all this off?" I shook my head. "The note," said Paul, "the note my son, well-meaning though he was, left on your doorstep." I just wanted to leave now. I was tired. "You ever heard of a tulpa?" said Paul, reaching forward and placing his hand onto my shoulder. I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at him blankly, leaning forward on my crutches. "Tulpas," Paul continued, "are these things that don't exist until you believe they exist. The more you believe they exist, the more they exist, and the more they exist the more they fuck with you." If I wasn't so tired I would have laughed, okay? Look. I'm not saying that's what this is, but it might be what this is. Sure. Mitch, bless him, he still thinks it's all real. Thinks it got to me years back, thinks it's controlling me now, using me to trick others into worshipping it or something. He smiled grimly. "It's a different story every time." Paul shook his head. "All I can say is this, it's not real, but the only way to stop it is to figure out what's wrong with your life and fix that." Something upstairs moved, 3 quick, staggering footsteps. Paul glanced up at the ceiling, then back down to me. "Ignore the intruder, and follow the rules until you've fixed your life, or until you stop believing it. Then you take the coat track out past city limits and you douse it in gasoline and you burn it. Okay?" "Okay," I said non-committally. Finally, he pulled his hand off my shoulder. "You need help with anything, I'm always here. You got booze problems, life problems, anything," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "This thing, it really messes with your head, makes it hard to know who you can trust, you know? Sometimes it feels like, it's almost, jumping in and out of people around you, controlling them. But it's all in your head." His tone was shifting now, almost sounding excited. Part of me wondered if the intruder was controlling him right now, deriving twisted pleasure out of messing with me. I shook off the thought and another thump upstairs. Paul acted like he didn't hear it. "I should go," I said, stepping backward. "Sure kid," said Paul, again talking to me like I was his son. I turned around and as fast as I could without tripping, I crouched my way out of the basement maze, up the stairs, and out the front door. I stepped out of Paul's house and took a deep breath of fresh air. It felt like getting rescued from a drowning river. I exhaled relief. At this point, I didn't trust Paul or Mitch or even fucking Howie for that matter. Nothing was stable, and everything was getting worse. I hobbled back across the street and my phone buzzed to life in my front pocket. I stopped in the middle of the road, pulled out the phone, and flicked on the screen. Squinting, I held it up to my face. 27 missed calls from Mitch Carver. Of course,